The king has imprisoned the Norseman as his hostage. As Osrith continued skimming the documents, the monk Kevin gave her information at top speed, about the king's arrival, the battle, the surrender of the Norse. It was a week before Christmas. The ground was hardening. Light reflected from the smoothness of the Idun, and she watched it each morning as the sun rose, scattering its beams through the ice crystals in the air so they sparkled on its surface. This place was so beautiful, and she fancied that she could see her Motja walking here and there, before traveling from west coast to east, to her marriage to her father at Bibbenberg. More people rode horses on the higher ground over at Strathclyde once, whether it was Viz or Norse, perhaps the Elsa Thurgilson brother, but none came to challenge Caoligwylid. It was beyond the fighting season, yet, armies still fought. Domhnall was still to fight. No news had come to Caoligwylid of a defeat or a victory. Each morning, as new scrolls were archived on the floor below her, she crept down to read them, searching for news, crushing the longing her gut bore, that she would be with him, fighting. But how she longed for it. Though she had triumphed, she would rather have been standing beside Domhnall. She hoped that whatever Grioghair, who had lauded them all as heroes a few nights before, needed to agree with Guthard, that it would be concluded with haste. She had spent the day after the battle away from the scriptorium. There was a certain amount of time needed to repair and reclaim and to bury the dead, and she had been helping the warriors until Tagged had pulled her aside, giving her news which made her heart sore. Grioghair had informed Tagged and Fergus that they were to prepare to sail. To where, Tagged did not know, but guessed Alba. Osrith thought that too, and suggested to Tagged that perhaps Domhnall had been victorious. Tagged did not know, taking up her hand as they walked by the river, but it was known that the Scots, all the southern lands called the Gaels Scots, Domhnall, had defeated the Thurgilson army, which the brothers had then turned in anger and little strategy onto Caoligwylid, with even worse losses for them. Osrith, looking down at Tagged as he trained with Fergus, remembered wishing he hadn't taken her hand, for it had taken all her will not to pull close to him, and kiss him. For, if the Gaels had defeated the Norse, thus suggested Domhnall had strength. She could not, yet, dare to believe he had won the throne from Eochaid and Gerrick. Osrith dragged her eyes away from Tagged, and forced herself to listen to the ebullient Kevin, her joy that she may be leaving for Alba overshadowing the monk's garrulousness. Of course, King Guthard wants to know the brothers are defeated. The one called Eric has been turned over to guarantee the peace. Usually, Kevin turned, looking at the ancient script of Wygardiden that Osrith was again reading. Hostages join the household. But, Guthard does not have a household here. He is married. Osrith thought of the Danish hay-coloured, weak-eyed ex-slave who she had saved from slaughter. Abbot True had told them that when they had arrived, he was not what she expected the king to be like. But, he had been chosen by Cuthbert, and she trusted the blessed scent of her land. Nevertheless, he had hardly gone screaming into battle, and imprisoning the Norseman was surely preferable to Guthard's than having him at large. It implied he thought the Norseman might escape, or worse, open the city up to attack, like the Greek horse statue at a battlefield before a city called Troy long ago. Then, suddenly, through the door, came King Guthard himself. Kevin put down the Cymric manuscript and looked a little abashed. He bowed, to cover his embarrassment at his free tongue. Brother Kevin, Guthard said, in his quiet, steady voice. Kevin glanced at Osrith, and was about to say something when the matins rang. Kevin made his apologies and left, the door and steps creaking in his wake. Lord King, Osrith acknowledged, as the door closed, getting to her feet, and bowing her head. No, no, my dear, it is I who must thank you. He smiled, a weak smile. The Norse have long avoided Caoligwylid, my own father, Hearthknut too. You have no doubt heard of his exploits. I have heard of them, Osrith replied, wondering why the king had sought her. She had planned to practice sword skill with Tagged and Fergus, but she could hardly ignore the king. She thought back to the names she remembered, that Domhnall had showed her. Hearthknut had raided into Strathclyde, but had, like the Norse brothers the day before, had been soundly defeated, which was why Guthard, captured as a slave, had been sold to King Eochaid, Harthknut slain and most of his army lost. It had made Harold Finehair, kin to the Thurgilson brothers, strong on Pitland's eastern coast. I am returned to Haligwafikland, of which Caligwilid is its capital as, yes, my dear wife died. He fingered the ancient parchment on which Talakan's poem of defeat to the Saxons was written. We lived at Eofic, for I am king of Northumbria. I have more claim than you, Osrith thought, hotly. My mother was of Urien's line, my father was of Ida's. Both the Britons and the Saxons have a better claim than any Dane, and judging by your reluctance to fight for your own kingdom, I could defeat you. But, he had not gained kingship through prowess, Osrith reminded herself, as the weak rays of the winter morning found the tower's window. If she challenged the king, she was challenging the church. And you are the warrior who saved my life, Guthard continued, when Osrith said nothing. I saw you fight, I have never seen the like. You were outstanding. Lord King, Osrith nodded, pleased he had noted her skill. Down in the courtyard, distant clatters of blades echoed upwards as the Britons beyond the walls of the city cleaned up the battlefield. You have worked well with the manuscripts. It is good to be the ally of Domhnall. Against Eochaid, you mean? Osrith asked, suddenly. Guthard's pale eyes brightened. Eochaid made a mistake, Guthard said, for which I forgive him like my mistake, and I pray those who I wronged that they, too, will forgive me. The slaves? Guthard nodded, and Osrith thought of Ethne again, Princess Ethne, once queen of Myhinirion, Domhnall's sister. She may be able to send word to him that she was alive. Would she forgive the plot that carried her away in shackles from the beach at Dara? Except, he will never forgive. Forgiveness is a Christian virtue. The man I wronged is a pagan, so I allowed that he avenge me by using my money to end a blood feud, and married my sister. Guthard looked out of the window, then, down to Osrith, then placed a parcel wrapped in cloth before her. In the distance, the matin bells rang again. I am to preside over a service of thanksgiving for our defeat of the Norsemen, Guthard went on, and my alliance with Domhnall. Guthard gazed down from the window again. Indeed, monks were bringing winter greenery into the church, along with silverware and, if Osrith was not mistaken, the casket holding the body of St. Cuthbert. Her heart soaring. They were going home, and soon. She had prepared her belongings, too. They just needed to be wrapped in her blanket. Unlike Tagd and Fergus, who were warm in the hayloft above the horses, the scriptorium was chilly at night. Osrith followed the saints' slow procession across the courtyard. Even Tagd and Fergus sheathed their swords with the Caligwilid guard. It being the season of Advent, Abbot True has prayed on the matter and has sought God's guidance, Guthard continued, watching Osrith as she looked down at the activity below. He decrees that we may celebrate our fortunes this evening, following the service with a feast and ale. Good news indeed. Osrith smiled, looking back to the king's face, and Guthard smiled at her. A feast was welcome. She could be with Domhnall's men, relax with the warriors, eat Fergus-sized portions, for she had, of late, found herself growing hungrier than usual. Perhaps this was a sign they would be soon heading home. This is for you, Guthard said, pulling away the cloth. Inside, a dress lay, carefully folded. Lord King, Osrith began, looking at the silk. It must have cost a fortune. I do thank you, but, it felt magnificent. But no. Lord King, I am a warrior. These are my clothes. Osrith pointed with her hands to the clothes that now barely fit. Ah, Guthard said, bending back a little. I intended for you to be by my side, my warrior, beside Cuthbert, of your land. It was at this point, Osrith thought, much later, that she should have known. Guthard knew too much about her without having conversed with her. Why had she not suspected? Instead, she had let Guthard unfold a dress fit for a Merovinian queen, holding it by the shoulders and allowing it to fall so she could see it. It would be no less an honor to stand beside you, Osrith, no matter what you wear. And, I will be going home, Osrith thought, back to Dunnottar. If it aided Domhnall's diplomacy, then she could. It wasn't forever. And, it was no less than spectacular. Osrith looked at the fibers, dyed with so much care and dedication to match all the thread's shades, to weave, to create. Lord King, I would be delighted. But Guthard wasn't listening. I will send a servant this evening to help. He smiled his strange, thin smile, before sweeping scriptorium. 10 minutes later, Osrith saw Guthard in a hurried conversation with Abbot True and 2 other monks, as they pointed, gesticulated, to various parts of the city before walking, swiftly, into the church. 88,888,888. But, she also may decide not to wear it, after all. Osrith's mind filled with Alba, and Constantine and Domnall. Was he king of all Alba now? Was Eochaid executed? What of Giric? Osrith found tagged in the stables, mucking out again. As Osrith pushed through the wooden doors, which creaked, he looked up, pausing from moving the clean straw into place. There is to be a service for the battle. Will you be there? Osrith enthused. Tagged said nothing. Fergus, who was up in the hay loft, climbed down the ladder. Yes, we are to parade with the guards of the fortress. There is to be a Thanksgiving service, Osrith continued, noticing there was none of her own enthusiasm at the prospect of returning to Alba in her comrades. Do you know, the king visited me in the scriptorium and gave me a dress to wear. Right. Tagged glanced at Osrith, a strange tone to his voice. Osrith made to reach for his arm, then stopped. She saw their blankets had been bundled into parcels. Back to Alba? To Domnall? Osrith was astonished as Tagged nodded. A swell of happiness arose in her stomach. It would be absolutely fine sailing presently. Though it was winter, the weather was fine, and they could reach Dund as easily as when they left it. Osrith wondered whether Greogair was coming with them, or remaining with the king. She watched Tagged sweep out the old straw. The thought soared again. This was her mother's land, a hybrid of the original Christian heathens following Pelagic and the Irish Church, which just overlaid Christianity onto the heathen beliefs, and the new Augustine Christianity. And, their city was, by and large, protected by the old one left behind by the Latins, now to be ruled by a Dane. It worked. Osrith loved it. But now they were returning to their king. I will be with you at the feast, Osrith continued. Tagged said nothing, but nodded, continuing to work. She glanced down at his hands which she longed to embrace with her own. She dared not look at his lips, for on these too, she wished to press her mouth. And at Dunotter, do as you wish, Osrith. Tagged snapped back, so suddenly that Fergus dropped his sword belt. Later, then, she nodded. Later Fergus, she added, then turned, crossing the courtyard and back to the scriptorium, not unseen by a watching figure. Put it out of your mind, she told herself, as the stairs to the top of the scriptorium creaked under her leather boot. Wear this dress, stand beside the king, then feast with the warriors and leave for Alba. What did Tagged have to be so cross about? Half came that afternoon, bringing a tub of water and a cloth. She smiled nervously at Osrith, asking her to undress so she could bathe her. I will, Osrith said, taking the cloth and the water. Took care to lock the door, carefully taking Buey and laying her sword on her cloak. She stood in the evening coolness and proceeded to unclothe, dipping the cloth into the water and wringing it out. She caught Half's expression as the Briton looked at her. You are a woman then? Osrith nodded. But you fight? She pressed, her small voice insistent. Women can fight, women do fight. She smiled at the girl's expression. And you will marry Galma now? I will, she said, handing Osrith a dry cloth, opening the back of the dress by drawing out the cord as Osrith patted herself dry. Then, Osrith's mind really saw the gift she had been given. Silk would show every crease, so she allowed Half to stand on a chair and glide the fabric over her body. The young girl pulled in the dress and it took Osrith's form. It was a little tight over her breasts and hips. Maybe she had been eating too much and been inside too much, and not enough fighting practice. They were to go home to Nai, and it would not take long to regain her strength. After Half had arranged her dress, she took a comb from her apron and smoothed it through Osrith's hair before arranging with a piece of the silk tied into her now jaw-length hair, reminding Osrith of Malmuir, as she dressed before the fair at Dara. The king was waiting for Osrith at the bottom of the scriptorium tower. Half helped her down each step and opened the heavy oak door. Guthard held out a hand, which Osrith took. It was soft and Guthard smiled when he closed his around Osrith's. "You look beautiful." His words were soft, only for her, and, despite the pageantry, Osrith smiled. Then she saw the procession. Every person in Caligwilid seemed to be standing, waiting to cross into the service, and she was aware many eyes were on her. She looked behind her, trying to find Tagd and Fergus. They were leaving tonight, Osrith reminded herself. She just had to stand, sit, pray beside King Guthard, and they would be soon rowing with the flow of the Idun. Next to the priests, St. Cuthbert's casket was high upon the shoulders of its bearers, and they crossed, solemnly, to the candle-lit monastery church. Guthard escorted Osrith to a large, oak-carved bench, close to the altar. Osrith sat, her eyes switching between Abbot True and Cuthbert, who lived so long ago and, for a man who heard God most clearly on a remote, bird-inhabited island, might well have considered his journey throughout Northumbria to avoid the Norse ironic indeed. Osrith sat and listened, and prayed, as True and the monks carried through the rites. Once or twice, she looked over her shoulder to catch Tagd's eye, but the warrior was looking at the floor. Behind him, the Norseman she had fought to save Guthard was looking at her, at the coffin of Saint Cuthbert, at the monks, at the king. It was as if he had never been in a church before, and perhaps he hadn't. His blonde hair was bound into a cord at the back of his skull. Small wisps moved with the currents of candlelight. He was bound, humiliated. Yet, he would not take his eyes off Osrith. She turned back, thinking of the feast. She could drink, she knew Tagd would, then maybe, she could make her way with him up to the hayloft rather than the scriptorium tower. If it did not come off, she could blame the ale. Osrith felt a blush on her cheeks as she thought of his hands on her body, and forced herself to dash them quickly. She was in church, for heaven's sake, in the presence of blessed Cuthbert. So, she closed her eyes, and prayed for the king, the kingdom, and to be free of enemies, and for Domhnall, that he was alive, and prospering. It was only when a hand touched hers that Osrith realized the service was over. It was the king who had touched her so lightly, and she put it into his, which was outstretched as she opened them. Their warriors, including Tagd and Fergus, had left, as too had Cuthbert, but several monks remained, and some of the guards. "My dear, you look radiant." Guthard took a small bow, as Osrith rose. "Come, kneel with me." Before the feast, before the altar they knelt. What were they praying for? Osrith wondered. A figure appeared, near the back of the church, indistinct and only for a second. Kevin was holding one of the altar candles, and he stepped a little closer to Osrith, his face beaming. "Well," he began, in his usual outpouring of words, "now you know." He grinned wider. "I would have told you, bound to have done, if I had not gone to matins this morning." Osrith frowned. "No what?" But Given thought he was playing into a game with her, and withdrew a little. Before he could say anything, Guthard was standing by her, hand outstretched again. But, it was Abbot True who spoke. He was unsmiling, but held his robe-cloth out to both Guthard and Osrith. "To the wedding of Guthard Harth-Knutson, King of Haligwifeckland and Northumbria and the ward of the King of Alba, Domhnall, second of his name of the line Alpin, Osrith Lackland." He had won. Osrith listened to the sentence again in her mind. Domhnall now had the throne at Dunnottar. The church was silent, as if waiting for Osrith to say something. Beyond the window, on the river, she saw Tagd, with Fergus, managing the coracle. Yes, she thought. Domhnall was king and they were leaving. We were leaving. Her mind corrected herself. And the rest of the taffel-pieces surrounded her. She glared at Guthard and yanked her hand away from his. True's cloth fluttered to the floor. "No!" Osrith shouted, backing away from the king. She stopped when she felt a point to her back. "Yes," growled a voice by her ear. It was Grioghair. She glanced at the river again, remembering what she had seen. There were only 2 crew in the coracle. She shifted uneasily under the point. "You think I would let Colleen's death go unpunished? Number. This is fitting. You will be a queen, and Domhnall will have his alliance." "No!" Osrith shouted as she stepped under duress back towards Guthard. The king was still smiling, but it was not as heartfelt as it had just been moments ago. "No, Lord King Abbot." She looked between True and Guthard, and added with all the dignity she could muster, "I am already married." Guthard looked across to Grio Fair, alarm on his face. "She is already married?" Behind him, some of the servants paused in their tasks, listening. Osrith noticed that Eric Thurgilson was also staring at her. "Tell me you have not wed Constantine," Abbot True exclaimed, a horrifying turn of politics playing out in his mind. "A hedge marriage, your grace, nothing more." "And here he scorned the word, husband, is gone." Griogr moved his head towards Osrith. "Though yourself and the young prince now ... I heard every moment of your night with him." In her chest, panic began to spread, like a wound unstemmed, spreading out throughout her. "Where is my sword?" Osrith demanded, recalling she had left it in the scriptorium. This one did NPT have the feel or weight of Buey. "Where are my clothes?" She began pulling at the dress, ignoring the laughter around her. Because, if she could get those, there was a good chance she could still catch up with the coracle. Griogr grabbed at the back of the dress, but Osrith ducked under his arm. The back cord dripped and suddenly, she was swamped in fabric. She pulled at the dress, to keep herself covered. "I am sure we would all like to see you naked," Griogr said, lunging for her again. But Osrith was too quick for him, and had swiftly drawn one of the guard's swords from its scabbard. She glanced at Guthard's face as she advanced on Griogr, feeling a little stab of guilt. It was clear now her marriage to Guthard was the alliance, and Osrith suspected that Griogr had swiftly used her as a bargaining piece to guarantee Guthard's alliance and risk his own forces to a prince who had yet to secure his kingdom. But, this time, and Osrith knocked Griogr's blade from his hand with remarkable ease, Domnall was not going to get his alliance. He was now king. Guthard's alliance was irrelevant. "I bound your hand, lady," True intoned, officiously. "You are wed to King Guthard." He swept an arm in an arc and pointed to a monk, who was writing onto a parchment in a huge volume, no doubt taken from the very room Osrith had slept in. "And, does it say Osrith Lackland?" Osrith stood towards Abbot True, Griogr still under blade. "It says, Osrith Lackland, ward of Domnall II, King of Alba," the monk replied. It still sounded good to Osrith as comped time. "But that is not my name," Osrith cautioned. "I am married, and my name is my husband's, Tagdavdoia." A smirk crossed Griogr's face. "He will be dead before he even gets to Alba," he scoffed. "He returns with only half his crew, at midwinter, in the most treacherous of seas." "He is Irish," Osrith continued. "Keep it going, long enough to formulate the plan." "And is it consummated?" This time, Abbot True asked the question. "What do you think?" Osrith laughed, lying. "Of course it is consummated, why else would we be hand?" And, she considered, she had it. "So you wish that I wed another, and have two husbands?" Osrith looked around at the people who remained in the church. She had noticed that many of the servants, even a few of the guards, were not Dane, Saxon nor Angle. She was of this country, the Old North. Bigamy was not tolerated within the British heathen faith further. A woman's word was as equal to a man's. Osrith had read it in the scriptorium, read it amongst many things of her mother's homeland, and knew exactly what she needed to do. Politics was delicate in Caerleiguilid, as in Cumbraland. The Saxons needed to hold on to the territory as it was nominally British, so tolerated the heathen practices, while the heathen accepted Northumbria was their kingdom. "I am sorry, Lord King." Osrith kept the blade of the warrior pointed at Griogr. "I claim the right to settle the dispute before the Dread," she said, "in Cymric." "Will he, or she make themselves known?" It took a few minutes. Anything happened. The Norseman moved in his chains, but no Dwight came forward. "Then, in that case," Osrith continued, her options narrowing suddenly, "I fight the king." This caused a stir. The monks behind True began to whisper. She plunged on, anger holding, refusing to let fear take its place. "If I lose, then God, the gods, know I am false, my marriage is false, and I will marry King Guthard." "You are already married to the king," True shot back. "If I win, I take this land, Eofuic and Northumbria, you are. I am Northumbria. Osrith raised her voice, at the denials of validity. But, she could see the Cymri were on her side. It was a hidden religious method of settling a dispute. After all, impossible, True declared. But Guthard was sweeping past Osrith, not looking at her, or indeed, anyone else. He paused, as if listening to something Eric was saying as he passed, then continued swiftly through the curved door. Impossible, shouted True again. Why? The voice came from the shadows. In the guttering candlelight stood the Northman. Why is it impossible? He glanced at Osrith. She offers fair rods. But the king, True continued. He is no longer here, said Eric, and, as I am here as a result of her skill, I offer to fight in my countryman's stead. Yes, Osrith agreed, nodding to Eric. It could very well be a trap, but she must take it. Abbot True looked at Grioghair. Secure her in the scriptorium, Grioghair said. But Osrith pressed the blade to his throat. Where? Grioghair asked. It is already dark. Here. Around them, seats were being drawn back. An area of bare oak planks were revealed. Yes, she could fight here. True. Are you mad? Grioghair asked, as Osrith assessed the ground. You cannot possibly accept this. She is the king's wife. Now it was Osrith's turn to smirk. She could win this, or she would never have prepared him. Shev had beaten the Norseman once before. Grioghair knew this. He knew, too, that it was his reputation that would be in ruins if he allowed it. But, as he was at the sharp end of Osrith's blade, he had little choice. I move, Abbot True continued, looking gravely at Grioghair, to speak for the king. Justice should be done. The outcome is God's will. He bowed his tonsured head. The proposal is sound. We should see how the queen defends the honor of her king. That wasn't what she said, and he knew it. Osrith made to clarify the point, but noticed that, already, the cords holding the Norseman fast were already loosening. Osrith made to steady her mind. Eric Thurgilson was standing in place of Guthard. He was Guthard in this fight. One of the guards handed him a sword, and he strode out to the cleared space in the center of the church. Osrith was about to raise her sword, but for a patter of small feet beside her, she turned. It was Haf. May Billanos be with you, she whispered, under the cover that she was securing Osrith's torn dress. Osrith turned, kissing the girl on the cheek. Thank you. Haf stepped back by her father who, Osrith noticed, was holding the girl's hand tightly. They were on her side, Osrith thought. She must not let them down. The Norseman could not be beaten on strength, for he was far stronger than Osrith. But, she was fleet, and though she felt a light-headed from the incense, she threw herself towards the Norseman, striking out with her inferior sword. There was a gasp as the blade caught him cleanly through the thigh and came away coated in crimson. But too late did she see the Northman's own sword, and her slowness was rewarded with agony as he used the flat of his sword to strike her chest. Osrith twisted toward him, but her leg buckled as he drove the blade towards her calf. He had kissed, and this time, she wasn't quick enough to move away. Osrith landed heavily on one knee, still lashing out towards the hostage with her blade, flashing in the candlelight, and she could see what she needed to do, and thrust herself forward with more strength than she thought she had. Their blades clashed as Osrith went on the offensive. Neither had a shield, so they were using their swords to defend the blows. He was weaker than she expected, though he was fighting Vlaz if he had no injury to his leg. A figure darted to Osrith's right. Who that was, Osrith didn't know, but it was enough for the Norseman to catch her in the small of the back. He stabbed with their hilt, and Osrith fell heavily, the room passing before her eyes. This was the end now, Osrith thought. He had beaten her, and, more than that, he was avenging his defeat by actually slaughtering her. Somehow, though, Osrith managed to roll away. Blood, presumably from the Northman, was flowing onto the wooden floor, and she got to her feet. Damn them! Anger began to flow through her. She had been parted from Tagged and Fergus, and her body was flabby. Weeks of little training was bearing out. She twisted up and was now behind the Northman, who had slipped on the blood, and she kicked his other ankle so that he slammed, chest first, onto the wooden floor. One more lunge brought down Eric. It was a foolish, childish move taught to her by Sainid, but it had worked. Then, She felt the pain in her hip, saw the blood absorbing into the cloth, the big gash down her thigh. Osrith tottered forward, her left arm clenched to her side. And then, she was falling towards the Northman and expected to fall heavily onto him, but was stopped in her tumble as a strong, protective arm wrapped around her chest and pulled her forcefully backwards into an embrace. She had won. The Northman was down, though the fight had been easy and swift. It was then that Osrith began to have doubts as Guthard, who had clearly witnessed God's decision, held fast to her. Osrith felt her heart beating. She refused to look at Guthard, however, and he loosened his grip of her as Eric Thurgilson staggered to his feet. "Do with her as you will," the king said, thrusting Osrith towards Grioghair, who grabbed her wrists tightly together. "My lord king." Abbot True started in Guthard's direction, and at Grioghair. "She is your wife. She is your queen. You are one, the annals declare it. When she learns to behave as one, we will see." Grioghair. Guthard turned. "My lord king," True exclaimed, scrambling past Eric, still lying on the floor, and out of the door. "Guards, remove the Norseman," he added, in his wake. "Do as I will." He looked Osrith, then barked orders to leave to the monk's servants and guards. "You will let me go?" Osrith demanded, but instead, Grioghair hauled Osrith by the arms behind the injured Northman, out of the church and into the icy courtyard. She struggled against Grioghair, who kicked the back of her legs. Osrith stumbled, and Grioghair caught her hair. She gritted her teeth in pain, as he pulled up her by it.